Good morning. So we have been going through the book of Luke, and as we were talking about the book of Luke, we recognized that it was one of three synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning they're going together, they're kind of parallel gospels. However, even though it was one of the synoptic gospels, it was very different than the other Gospels. Matthew, written primarily to Jews from a Jewish standpoint. Mark, I think he was probably an engineer because it's very short and to the point and direct. But Luke is told from a standpoint of a Greek who comes to know the Lord. Probably more than likely not a Jew, based on his name, as well as the fact that he's a physician, educated man. He refers to the fact that he's writing a letter to somebody called Theophilus, which would also be a Greek name, somebody that he knew well. And he refers to the fact that they came to know the Lord and believed in it, but this is kind of more of a reassurance of everything that we've heard. So I think Luke probably was coming from a Greek background, and he's wanting to share with other people what he's discovered, because he went to great lengths to go and interview people and talk to people about what they saw firsthand. So the eyewitnesses of what had happened with Jesus. And so he goes and he collects this information. So I personally really enjoy looking at the book of Luke, because I see this guy who is an investigative reporter going out and gathering all of this information so he can share it with us. And I think of him going and talking to people like Mary and maybe hearing firsthand about baby Jesus growing up, or maybe even talking about some of the different disciples and hearing their stories and then trying to narrow it down to a book form, you know. And I think it would be just awesome to have been in his shoes, to hear the things that he heard and to be able to write that down. That's pretty cool. But what kind of things would he be sharing with us that maybe Matthew or Mark would not have shared? Today's scripture, coming from Luke chapter 6, is actually talking about something that the others have addressed and quoted Jesus on. But again, thinking about it from his standpoint, I would imagine he's kind of learning some of this stuff himself, because he did not grow up Jewish, more than likely. More than likely, he did not hear all of these things firsthand, because he probably would not have been worshiping with the Jews. But in Luke chapter 6, he begins by talking about the Sabbath. So he starts out, one Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Now, from my standpoint, my concern was not the fact that it was the Sabbath. My concern was that they're walking through this field and they're stealing the food. That was my concern when I read this is, what about the farmer? Did he ask the farmer if it was okay? What was the deal with that? So I actually looked it up, and there is actually a scripture that says, if you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to their standing grain. So it was actually okay. So that cleared my conscience. Okay, now it's okay. But that, by the way, just as a reference, that was found in Deuteronomy 23 and verse 25. So the fact that they were walking through the field, picking heads of grain, rubbing it in their hands and eating it, was not an issue. Have you ever done that? Have you ever tried to eat grain? Those things are hard. I think it would break your teeth if you did that very much. But evidently there's probably a trick to it, or possibly the fact that at different times it's softer. I don't really know. I'm not much of a farmer. If you go by my farm, you'll see that it's mostly weeds. So don't count on me to have a whole lot of information about farming. But the idea that they could go out through the fields and they could gather some food to eat, that wasn't the problem. The problem was they were doing this on a Sabbath. Now, if you look at what the Sabbath was, Jesus said to the Pharisees, the Sabbath is not created, or man was not created for the Sabbath, but rather the Sabbath was created for man. So his understanding of the Sabbath was that God set aside the Sabbath for our benefit, not for us for the Sabbath. And he didn't create us to honor the Sabbath. That was for our benefit. So in other words, I believe what God was saying was that 6 days I worked, the seventh day I rested. You should do the same, because we all need rest. I mean, no matter how good things are, no matter how much we enjoy something, we need our rest. And without that rest, our bodies break down, we get tired, we're more vulnerable, more likely to get some kind of a disease or cold or something. So we need our rest, and God knows that because he created us. I mean, the inventor of the body should be able to tell us through his word what we need, and that's exactly what he did. He says we need our rest. So when we look at the Sabbath through God's eyes, he's created it for us to be able to rest. But he knew our tendencies. Our tendency is if I can get this much done in 5 days, then I can get this much done in 6 days. I'll just take that extra day. My wife and I were reading this book a couple of months ago, and he was talking about how if only I had 10 more hours in a week, how much could I get done? And he said, I read 120 books this year. I could read 150 books this year. And I'm like, 120? I mean, 5, maybe 6 books, but 120 books? Why would you want to read more than that? But no matter what we do, no matter where we're at, if we just had 10 more hours, we could fill it. And it really wouldn't benefit us, because then it would just be that it would be 10 more hours tired than we were. And that's what God said. I want you to rest. I want you to take a break and enjoy what I've created for you. And if we would listen to that, I mentioned a few weeks back that I read this statistic that said people who observe the Sabbath to take 1 day a week and rest lengthen their life up to 10 years on average. That's pretty impressive. If you could actually do that, it makes sense. God's saying, take some rest, and you're actually going to. It's kind of funny that if you add up the Sabbaths that you're resting, it actually adds up to 10 years on an average lifespan. So it's kind of funny. He's saying you can shorten your life and you can use those days up, but you're going to end up with the same amount of time. So might as well relax and enjoy it on Sabbaths. But anyway, no charge for the side note there. That's free. So Jesus is walking through the field with his disciples, and his disciples are eating this grain right along with him, and they come across some Pharisees. Now, if you're like me, you might be looking at this and saying, man, there must be a lot of Pharisees out there, because he keeps running into them all the time. They're always questioning him. I think what the deal was is they were watching him, and they were waiting for him to make mistakes because they were ready to attack. You ever had that happen to you? You feel like that everywhere you turn, there's somebody waiting for you to make a mistake so they can nail you? Well, that's what the Pharisees were doing. And why were they doing this? If you think about it, it's just a guy with a few disciples, people following him. And I would imagine that this was probably the apostles that were walking with him, even though it refers to them disciples. There was probably just a dozen or so walking with him through this field. And so why would they have been so concerned and trying to demolish this one man and his few disciples? Well, I think we're going to find out here in just a minute. So let's read in chapter 6 and verse 3. Jesus answered them, "Have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for the priest to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" So he did two things here. Some would look at it as he justified the fact that he was doing this on the Sabbath. The idea that he's using David as an example of this is saying, okay, David did this. Why wouldn't it be okay for us? And it's a little different story. The story actually is found in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And it's the showbread that the priests were eating. They would put it before the Lord, and then they would eat it. It was kind of day-old bread, but the priest would eat this bread. And that was the only thing that was available. So here's the circumstances. David and his men have been fleeing from Saul because Saul is trying to kill them. They get to the point where they're starving. They have to have substance. So they go to the priest. So the priest has a decision to make. It's against the law to give this showbread to anyone other than the priest. But if I don't, these people are going to die. So what's the choice? I mean, that's a pretty easy choice in my mind. But at the same time, looking at it from their perspective, I'm breaking the law, but I'm actually doing something positive. So Jesus is giving this as an example of what he is doing. He's walking through the fields, picking the kernels of wheat. There's a second part to this, and that is that there is the law that God gave us, and then there's the law, or most people called it the oral traditions of the Jews. So did God ever say, don't go through the field and pick food on the Sabbath? Or did he ever instruct us that we can't do something, walk, everything? There were some very specific things that God told his people. During the time that they were being led out of Egypt, he gave them some specific things. Don't go out and collect firewood or things on the Sabbath. That's a day of rest. And we can look at that and say, okay, that means we can't do anything on the Sabbath, right? We shouldn't do anything. But what the deal was is God was providing them with food. He was delivering to their feet quail and manna for them to collect. And each day you collected what you needed for that day. If you tried to collect more so that you could take it easy the next day, it would spoil and rot. But on the sixth day of the week, when you're getting ready to take the seventh day off, the eve of the Sabbath, you could collect 2 days worth and it wouldn't rot the next day. This is all God saying, I'll take care of you. I'll provide for you. I'll give you what you need. Just trust me. Just listen to what I'm telling you. Follow my instructions. You'll be fine. Everything will be great. And that's the instructions that he is giving to his people. So now Jesus is saying, you're missing the point. It wasn't about whether I walk through the field and pick kernels or not. It's where's my heart? What is the spirit of the law? The spirit of the law is that he doesn't want us to labor, to be busy on this day. He wants us to take a day off so that we can remember what he's done for us, that we can enjoy a day of rest and relax. So in that day, they would travel many miles as they would go from one town to the next and around. It was quite a bit of traveling. So I'm guessing that just walking through a field would have been just a Sunday afternoon jog. You know, just I don't know if you guys live in farming roads or not, but when I go home on a Sunday afternoon, I usually get stuck behind somebody that's Sunday afternoon driver. And that's not the same thing as the 60 mile an hour on the 50 mile an hour road that I normally can do. So never mind, we're not going there. But what was the intentions? What was God's desire? So I did a little bit of research, and it turns out that the Pharisees had developed a system of 613 laws, 365 negative laws, do not do that, you shall not do this, and 248 positive laws, the things that you should do. And these laws accumulated up to 613 oral traditions. Now, if you go through and you look at God's laws, there are not that many laws. I mean, you could basically sum it up in maybe 10 laws, you know. It's basically fairly simple. He gives some clarification and some additional information, but pretty much you can sum it up in 10 laws. And he's saying to him, he says, why do you have all of these laws? What are they for? And here in Luke chapter 6 here, we see that these men are coming to him with man's laws and binding those on us as being regulations, laws that we have to fulfill. There's been a lot of different illustrations of this over the years, but I ran across one a few years ago that kind of struck me. I was listening to the newscast. This was on nationwide TV news, and the newscaster is saying, you've implemented a new law in your church or new regulations in your church. Can you tell us about it? And he says, well, what's happened is in the last couple of months, we've lost 3 of our men to heart attacks. And so we have implemented this. We are telling everyone to go out and go to the doctor and get checked out. But it wasn't a suggestion. It was a do this or else. And I thought, wow, that was, I could see it making a suggestion. Man, we've lost so many men. It just really hurts me. Please go out and get checked out. But they had made it almost a requirement. And it was like, man, that sounds a little bit Pharisaical. And so as I'm looking at this morning and talking about this, it's like, what was the idea that the Pharisees were trying to implement? They were taking and building a fence to protect people from something. So one of the illustrations that I've heard is that there's this cliff at the edge of town and people kept falling off the cliff. So they built a fence that was 20 foot back off the cliff, and they told people, do not cross this fence. If you do, you'll surely die. And but really, they could still cross the fence. And they could still go 5 or 10 foot out without being in any danger. So people would jump the fence and they'd go out there and they'd look at the beautiful views from there. And then eventually they would get too close to the edge and they would fall. So the point is that when we establish something, a fence back off of the edge, and say, this is now unsafe. Anything past this is unsafe. But then somebody tests it and they're fine. Then we say, oh, it's okay. We'll go a little bit further until we're back into danger again. What if instead they put a sign up saying, 20 foot from this fence is a cliff that is very dangerous. Please stay on this side of the fence for your own safety. Now you've declared that the cliff is over here, but we put this up for your protection. There's a difference. And that's what the Pharisees originally intended to do, was to create a safety net to keep people from breaking the laws of God. What instead they did, though, was it became a law in and of itself. And by doing that, now it's no longer just an oral tradition. Now it becomes law. And Jesus is speaking out against that law. So here's what he says. I forgot to mention in verse 5, then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. This is where the feathers start getting ruffled, because he tells them that I, Jesus, am the Son of Man and the Lord of the Sabbath. And so they start really getting upset about it at this point, because now you're claiming to be somebody that we don't know that you are. But here's what happened in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. So not only are they watching for him to make a mistake, but they intentionally show up on the Sabbath so that they can watch and see if he's going to do this. Because if he does, wham, I got him. That's it. That's what we're looking for. Now I want you to think about this for a moment. If you were sick, if you had some disease, and you knew that Jesus was going to be in the synagogue teaching on this day, wouldn't you just kind of happen to drift into this so that you could be healed? I would imagine that this happened a lot. As a matter of fact, it's recorded that it does happen a lot. And so they're looking for Jesus to heal him. And so a man whose arm is shriveled. I don't know exactly what that was, what had happened, but apparently it was very obvious, visually obvious, that this man was, his arm was disabled, unable to work, and maybe even to the point where it was bound up to where he couldn't move it or use it. I don't know. But whatever it was shriveled, and the teachers of the law are waiting for Jesus to do something about it. In verse 8, but Jesus knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he didn't just quietly do this. He announces it to him and to everyone else. Stand up and stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or destroy it?" Now, would this matter to a Pharisee? Now, a Pharisee would say, hey, let him die. Let this bad thing happen. Let him go. But Jesus says, what's better? To do something good or to do something bad? To help someone or to abandon them? And so Jesus makes a choice out of it for them, and they have to choose. Well, they don't choose. They don't want to choose because they would condemn themselves. And so he asks them, which one should I do? And they don't answer him. He looked around at all of them, and then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. I have heard people talk about, I was feeling really bad. I thought this was it. And so I prayed and I was healed. I've had those things happen myself. But to see something that is obvious and then all of a sudden it's better, to see somebody that has leprosy and all of a sudden their skin is clear, it's like, there's no denying this. This is not just somebody's imagination. Well, that's the situation here. His hand was shriveled. It was not usable. And he says, stretch out your hand. And as he does, it comes back to normal. That would be a miracle. That would be amazing to see. And so Jesus uses this very visual, very apparent miracle to say, okay, you saw it with your own eyes. This happened. It wasn't just somebody's imagination. It wasn't just a story. It really happened. But this is the response that the Pharisees had. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Why did it make them so furious? As I was saying before, there's sometimes something behind the scenes that we don't really understand. Well, with the Pharisees, there was a pride. The pride issue is that we are righteous because of how good we are, all that we do. They would wear bands around their heads and around their arms to show that we have God's word with us at all times. They would write it on their hands that says, it says that they would take and fast. And when they fasted, as we saw last week, they would fast, but not for the purpose of praising God or worshiping God or even asking for God's guidance. That wasn't the purpose. It was so everybody would see what they were doing, so they could brag about it. They were righteous in their own eyes. Because they were righteous in their own eyes, they felt like that they were justified, that they were right in God's eyes. But what do we find out? God says, Jesus says, if you are fasting for others to see, then you've already received your reward. You've already gotten it. That's it. If you are fasting for a deeper relationship with God so that you can ask God for guidance, direction, then that's your reward there. But if you just want to show everybody else how good you are, you've already done it. That's it. And here, Jesus is calling this into question, and he's saying, what is your purpose? If your purpose in worshiping God and following God is to learn from him, to gain from him, to be a better person, then here, let me show you. Here's a choice. Do I help this person or do I not? Well, it's an easy decision for me. I mean, I think most of us here would say, yeah, help him. You know, it's not costing you anything, just help him. But for the Pharisees, this was a pride issue, because now you're stepping on their oral traditions, their laws that they have implemented. You can't do that. If you do, you're breaking the law. And Jesus was speaking against that and saying, you're forcing things on us that God did not force on us. So what does that mean to us, you and me? We typically do not hold people to the Sabbath. We encourage people to take a day off, to take a day of rest, and I would encourage you to go to the doctor and get checked out for medical things. You know, those are things that I would encourage you to do. But I'm not making laws. I'm not making these regulations. I looked up to see how many laws there were in the United States. And it turned out that the Congress had tasked this guy to find out how many laws and regulations there were. He ended up spending 2.5 years with a crew of people trying to come up with an answer. He came up with, for just that area where he was at, there was 23,000 laws. It took him 2.5 years just to find that out. And he said it would take us 2.5 lifetimes to go through all of the documentation and regulations and come up with a complete list of laws. Well, if you know anything about the laws that are generated daily, they would be outdated before they can make it. But what does it gain us? What does all of these hundreds of thousands of laws, what do they gain us? Nothing. Because we are creating these things based on catches, loopholes. We got to block that one. We got to open up this one. A few years ago, there was a law passed in the state of Washington that the police officers could not pursue someone. So if you chose not to stop, they had to stop. By the way, in case you're thinking this is a good idea, it changed last week. So now they can pursue you. So don't take this. But the point of it was that the lawmakers said, man, people die whenever they get into car chases with the officers. So let's eliminate car chases. But what they didn't figure on is how many people died because people were driving erratically or out and not stopping when the officers would light them up. And so they actually increased the number of accidents because those people would go then and hurt other people. This happened in Tri-Cities a few months back, where they had the guy, they were trying to stop him, but they were not allowed to chase him. So he goes off and caused 2 more accidents before they finally blocked him. So I got off on a rabbit trail here, but my point is this. Adding more laws and more restrictions is just trying to block these loopholes and things. What it boils down to is Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's what Jesus asked us to do. So for us today, think about, is this something that benefits myself, benefits others? Does it benefit my relationship with God? When you start asking those kind of questions, it simplifies things a whole lot. Can I do this? Is it something that I can do? And if it is, would it be of God's desire? Is this what God wants me to do? To try to narrow it down that way, instead of trying to figure out all of these different laws and regulations, can simplify our lives and make it more in line with what God's desire was by creating what little laws that he did create. His desire in creating those laws were not to keep us from having fun and enjoying life. It was to keep us safe, to give us what we want. So when he tells us to not have extramarital relationships, I believe what he's saying is if you do that, you're going to suffer. It's going to cause you pain. Don't do it. Not because he didn't want us to go out and have fun, because he knows that that's not the best for us. And so when we look at these laws, we see the heart of God is for us, for you and I. So simplify things by just looking at what it is that God would want us to do. What is his desire for us? And why would he want us to enjoy our lives? He loves to bless us. He loves to give us these things. And he's saying, if you do this, I am blessing you there in that. So he has already blessed us in these things. So this morning, I guess it's kind of a thought process here. Is it something that you can implement? It's every day. It's every moment. It's not just whenever you run into a wheat field and you wonder whether or not you should pick these kernels. It's whether or not everything that you do, is it for God's glory? Is it something to help, to further, or is it hurting? Is it damaging? And that kind of simplifies things down a little bit.